You're listening to Two Bobs, conversations on the art of creative entrepreneurship with David C. Baker and Blair Enns.
David, the organizations that hire you and I to speak at their conferences, et cetera, the people I'm talking about.
The really smart ones.
The really smart ones who pay us a lot of money to come in and talk about whatever it is that we talk about. I remember one of those people whom you know well and I know well as well. And he said to me when we were talking about a theme for a conference or what I was going to speak on, he said, man, there's two recurring themes that everybody wants to talk about. One is, how do I build this business? That's kind of my domain, business development. And the other is, how do I sell this business? Yeah. And that's at least one area of one domain of yours. Yeah. So I think today we're going to talk about why, when, and how principals sell their firms. Now, what qualifies you to be our resident expert on this topic?
That sounds like a really loaded question, because all I could think about, I'll answer the question, but all I could think about was, like, aren't you the guy who says, I'm never going to leave my firm? And so here I have somebody who's very skeptical about ever selling your firm interviewing me. I should have picked a more...
I was going to drop that bomb at the end. Oh, this is stupid. You should never sell.
You're just going to lead me along for half an hour and then, okay. So back to your question. So I've done about 600-700 valuations of firms, and then I have led 140 or so transactions of different types, which might mean the merger of a firm or selling to a holding company or buying another firm. I represent both the buy and the sell side. I didn't actually used to do that work at the beginning. I didn't know anything about it. It was the main reason I didn't do any of it. But I found that my clients who trusted me because of our work together kept asking me for help in that regard. And so I had to really learn it. So that was about, 18, 19 years ago. And since then, been doing a lot more of that. It's pretty much under the radar. Every once in a while you hear of a deal that I did, but mostly it's pretty confidential. So it's just, I don't say too much about it normally. So it's fun to talk about this some more.
Yeah, I remember like many times being in conversations with you, and it was almost like covert stuff that you were working on, and something would come out. You'd be searching for maybe a buyer, or we were talking about a shared client, and you would share something that had just happened that I had no idea you were working on.
Yeah.
So over the years, I've had inquiries on this too. When I was a new business development consultant, people would ask, "Do you do mergers and acquisitions work?" And I always thought it was the oddest question. I think there's nothing about business development other than that there's money involved.
Yeah, which perked your ears up a little bit, right?
Yeah, of course. And I thought, whoa, yeah,
I guess
make
I
a
do.
lot of money at this.
Tell me more about this. Tell me more about your interest.
No, I never took the bait, though. Okay, so let's talk about why principals sell. It might sound like a silly question, but are there certain triggers that make people, owners of creative firms, decide, okay, this is it, I'm done, time to start looking for a buyer?
Yeah, right. Other than just a bad Monday, after a great weekend or something.
3 bad days. Yeah.
It's really interesting because one of the first instances of pattern recognition, which you and I have talked a lot about, came to me related to this. It's so odd. It's such a coincidence, really. I just noticed that principals were more introspective than normal during certain phone calls, and I had no idea why. And it took me a long time to figure it out. And finally, it hit me that principals were most introspective about 9 to 10 months before a lease boundary. So in other words, they were getting ready to have to make a decision about what they were going to do about where their agency was housed. They were going to either renew the lease or buy a building or whatever it was. And what was striking about that, after I thought about it some more, is that was the only time principals ever made a long-term commitment to their business. Every other decision they made, hiring somebody, buying a piece of equipment, changing a positioning, could either be reversed or just stopped. But once, especially if they were signing a personal guarantee for a space, they were making, and in some parts of the country, like in New York, for instance, you're signing a 10-year lease. Most leases are more around the 5-year, but that just set off this chain of events in their minds, and they were thinking, do I want to do this for another 5 years? So there were certain triggers that made them think a little bit differently about the business. They didn't necessarily want to get out of business at that point, but they just stopped and said, okay, how's this going? Do I want to do this for another 5 years?
Makes me wonder, as you say that, how many of those principals of creative firms who sign up for our Win Without Pitching training program, I wonder how many of them have just committed to a lease. They've just made this long-term commitment.
Yeah.
So they think, well, I guess I'd better fix that new business problem.
Well, they obviously want to stay in business and thrive for multiple years, because the commitment they're making through that training program is, half a year, 2 years, 3 years, depending on how that unfolds.
Infinity.
Yeah, infinity, right.
That's the Hotel California.
Yeah, right.
You can check out, but you can never leave.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the signing a lease is what you might call the hard trigger. Are there softer triggers that get people thinking about selling the business?
I'd be interested to compare notes with you on this, but I find that there's always this earnout period, except in very few cases. So they have to work for the firm that's acquiring them for a period of time. That's the earnout period. So you have to anticipate when you're going to be done. You can't just wake up and say, okay, I'm done, and then sell your firm, because you can't just walk away right after the sale transaction. And so when they're anticipating when they're going to be done, usually there are two factors there. One is, when do they start to get tired of clients? That usually happens first. And then they get tired of employees. I've often joked that if I could write a book and without giving anybody any sense of what's inside it, I just tricked them into buying it first. And basically the promise was you could run a very successful agency without clients or employees. I bet I could sell a lot of copies of that, because that's you. And it's usually in that order. Have you seen that, by the way? I've never really talked to you about that, getting tired of clients, and that sort of triggers something for them.
Oh, yeah. I think I own the domain consultingwithoutclients.com.
Oh, really?
I don't remember. Yeah, I think so. Well, you've experienced this, I'm sure. So as a consultant, you go into a business, and the owner of the business says, well, I really envy you. You're a consultant. You've got
Right.
this free life. You've got nobody you're responsible for. You just flit in, make a bunch of money and flit out. So they see consulting as kind of a higher ideal, more idealistic version of what they're doing, because there are no employees. And then I joke, and then you get to the consultant level, and what you really fantasize about is consulting without clients. And that's called speaking and writing.
That explains why I'm drawn to that. Yeah. Yeah, but these principles, they do get, especially if they aren't positioned really well, I think there's a connection there, because they have to go through this learning process with every new client. That's part of it. Also, the expectations that the client has of them, if they aren't positioned well, are so out of the park sometimes. They're not really sure what they're doing with each new engagement. So it's worse for firms that aren't well positioned, but there is something about that. Get tired of clients first, and then you get tired of employees, and then the next step is basically, I'm done, right? So you have to anticipate that. Those are some of the softer triggers.
Is there an upward trend in the number of principals? Are you doing more evaluation work?
I am. A lot more valuation, a lot more merger acquisition work. There's more happening, and it's not just my practice. There are 5 or 6 of us that do really good work, and really solid work, good people doing it. And for all of our practices in this M&A field, it's up for all of us. Probably, I think there could be a few things happening. One is that there's less expectation that you're going to pick a career and that it's a lifetime choice. People do feel like they can pretty much start over in their 40s or 50s, maybe even in their late 30s. So that's part of it, I think. There's also less stigma about exiting. I used to talk with so many clients who really should have shut down their firm or should have sold it because of many different reasons, and they just were they were terrified of the stigma in their community. For one thing, there's not as much tie to your local community, so that's not as big an issue. And And business is, it's generally good. This is more speaking to it from the buyer side. So business is good. Their businesses are growing, but they want to achieve something on a much larger scale, and they're not seeing that they can reach those goals organically. And so that's what prompts them to reach out to a firm and consider buying it. Those are some of the things that seem to be influencing the market right now. I mean, all that could change if there's some huge political disaster or geopolitical war or an economic downturn across the world. That could change it. But at the moment, and for the last 3 or so years, things have been really good, very active.
Huh. Okay. Yeah, I think I've seen that trend as well. But there's also like different types of acquisitions going on, right? Like there are things that are kind of happening now that haven't really happened a lot before.
Yeah, for sure. There are some fake purchases that are much smaller. At the very highest levels, there are some large firms that are entering this space. So as marketing moves more and more towards digital, and you and I have threatened that we really need to talk more about this at some point, that all marketing is really digital. So why are we talking about digital? But the movement towards digital is really sparking the interest of players outside this field to get in it, like IBM and some of the large accounting firms, some of the big management consulting firms. They are really interested in buying some of these smaller firms to have access to their client base, to have access to their IP. They don't really intend to build on those firms that they're buying. They just want to sort of have a leg up and get a head start on the marketplace. But this, I think the marketing field that you and I serve is going to look drastically different over the next few years, more different over a shorter period of time than it ever has. And a lot of that is driven by outsiders, that is non-agencies that are buying up agencies for lots of different reasons. Even the client side people are buying agencies. That usually, in other words, you have a big client, and usually it's a client concentration issue, client that's big on your roster. And they just say, "Hey, why don't we just buy you?" That's happening more and more. Some really famous ones too, like Capital One buying Adaptive Path, and there's about 50 of those examples that have really rocked the industry, made it pretty interesting to talk about.
Yeah, and there seemed to be a flurry of those types of deals over about a 2-year period, and then it seems to have quieted down a little bit.
It has, yeah.
You're seeing some trends in acquisitions, are you? Beyond the odd ones we've just talked about?
Yeah, right. If we take those outliers out of the picture, there are some trends, and almost every one of them is good, honestly. Good for the seller, the selling firm. And since I work for smaller private independent firms, I'm usually representing the seller side, although I'll dip in and help the buying side sometimes. But some of those trends would be shorter earnouts. So in the past, it's really odd. The deals all looked exactly the same, and they almost looked like they came from the same word template. They were always the same mix of cash at closing and a note paid over time, and then an earnout. And the earnout was always 5 years. In other words, you didn't get all of the money until you'd been there 5 years, and only if you hit certain performance targets. Those earnouts are shorter. They're usually 3 years now, sometimes shorter. I've negotiated a few that are 1 and 2 years, a couple that are all cash at closing. They don't have to be the same for every principal as well. So if you have a firm that's run by 2 principals, one of them might be wanting to leave, one might want to stay. We can tailor that to them. That's one trend that's pretty unique. The other is that there are much fairer non-competes, and that mirrors the fact that firms are not run by principals who see this as a sort of a career for life. And so they are free to do other things, even a few other things during the earnout, but a lot of things after the earnout. Usually there's this buffer of a year or two where they can't do anything that would hurt the acquisition's value, but after that they can do what they want. There are more reasonable performance targets. You don't have to have a spreadsheet to calculate them anymore. It's usually 1 or 2 things that are reasonably achievable, and both parties agree on them and feel good about them. There's more cash at closing. So when you think about the total purchase value, purchase price, more of that, a larger percentage of it is in cash at closing. That every deal varies significantly. And then, there are, as I mentioned, there's lots of non-traditional buyers, and something we've already talked about. So all of those trends are really good for the seller, and since I'm usually representing that side, I think that's a good thing. Yeah.
That seems to imply that the reason why firms are being bought is different, or they're being looked at differently by the acquirer. So if we take the kind of that short-term, well, I assume it's a short-term blip, but if we take that blip of clients and management consulting firms, et cetera, buying agencies, we put that aside. Is there something, are the acquirers looking at these acquisitions differently now?
They are. In the past, it was a way to achieve greater growth back in the early 2000, 2001, 2002 time period. After that, it was driven a lot by PR firms that were trying to buy a presence in a major market that they didn't already have a representation in. Nowadays, in some cases, they're trying to buy capacity. So the firm that they're purchasing already complements their positioning. That's a little bit rare. More nowadays, we would call the purchases strategic purchases, which simply means that they're not buying capacity. They're not buying a chunk of revenue that they can add to their income statements. It's something else. It's bigger. It's also a handy way to say the financial performance of this firm you're buying isn't fantastic. So let's make sure there's another reason you're buying it, because if we just evaluate the deal based on the financial performance, we're not going to get enough money in the sale. So we call those more strategic purchases. And yes, those are being driven all up and down from small to big firms. They're looking for, let's say we want somebody who really understands, say it's UX, for instance, or maybe there's the best app dev firm around, or maybe it's around conversions. So or affiliate marketing or something like that. There's a very, very specific reason. And of course, probably what you're thinking already is like, another reason to be a well-positioned firm, because that definitely that is the primary driver for selling your firm for a good chunk of change is that positioning that you have.
You're listening to Two Bobs, conversations on the art of creative entrepreneurship. Your hosts are David C. Baker of Recourses, author, speaker, and advisor to owners of expert firms, and Blair Enns of Win Without Pitching, the sales training and coaching program for creative entrepreneurs. For more information, go to twobobs.com. If you find this podcast helpful, please help us by telling a friend and rating us on iTunes. Thank you. Now back to David and Blair.
Well, when I look at these trends, shorter earnouts, fairer non-competes, more reasonable performance targets, more cash at closing, it seems to me that the reverse of all of those things were in like long earnouts, less fair non-competes. They were all about tying the principal to the firm after the firm was bought as a means of kind of mitigating the risk or lowering the uncertainty of whether or not that revenue is going to stick around. And so now there's either more certainty that revenue is not tied to the relationships that the principal has, or it's something else.
Yeah, I think it is a little bit more of a more mature perspective about how the principal, how tied they are to the revenue. But it's also that principals are so much more aware of what it takes to run a smart business nowadays. So they've often arranged their business so that they are not as central. It's a really good thing. And it's showing up in how good these transactions are, how well these transactions are valued, essentially. But that is true. If these big firms are not buying the smaller independent firms for the money and it's more of a strategic purchase, then what is it that they're really getting? That what they want, they often want something different in their leadership team. So they might want some younger folks or a more diverse set of folks on the leadership team. That's part of it. One of the largest is that they want access to your client base. They want to be able to sell what they are already doing at the mothership into the relationships that you already have, your existing relationships. So that's part of it as well.
Yeah. Okay. So the service of the firm being acquired is complementary to the service that I'm currently offering.
Right. Yeah. But I've got, relationships with 20 Fortune 1000 clients, and 3/4 of those are not already on the roster of the mothership, so this is going to allow me to do it. And then conversely, if the principal is wanting to sell, there may be nothing wrong with their firm, the smaller firm. They might just want to play on a larger stage, and that's frequently the case. They want to play on a larger stage. They want new business to be a little bit easier for them. They don't have any problem closing the sale. They don't have enough opportunities to close it. That's how they think, whether it's true or not. That's how they think. And so they want to play on a bigger stage. And employees, of course, are open to that as well.
So you've listed some positive new trends that are kind of favorable to the seller, and there's some worse new trends I'm sure you have. But before I forget, I wanted to ask you about roll-ups. Roll-ups are kind of like there's peaks and valleys, or the pendulum swings both ways. They seem to be a bunch of them on at one time, and then they just all stop.
Right. People come to their senses and they stop.
Where are we in the roll-up cycle?
There are a few silly roll-ups happening, and I guess I've been pretty obvious here about how I feel about them. I'm not a fan of roll-ups. A roll-up is simply buying lots of firms or putting lots of firms together like a big clump of spiders and then trying to sell the clump of spiders to somebody else. There's so many reasons why they're not a good idea, and they do pop up from time to time, but as soon as it's obvious that somebody is being approached by somebody who's trying to manage a roll-up, then I usually discourage them from looking at it. For one, you just don't have much control over what other firms they're going to add. The other is that they're growing so quickly that there are usually some pretty severe cultural issues. And usually you're paid in not so much cash, but because there is no money in this firm yet, you're paid in stock from the mothership, the firm that's acquiring you. So there's just so many things out of your control. Some of my clients still do it, and I still manage those deals for them, but usually it's because something's not going all that well at the firm and they don't have many other options.
Have you ever brokered any deals of independent firms selling to a network agency or holding company?
Yes, for sure. Yeah.
Okay, my question I want to ask you is, have any of those selling principals ever looked back on the transaction afterwards and thought, well, that was a good thing?
Maybe of the 140 so transactions, all those haven't been to the major holding companies, but I would say maybe 2 of them have looked back and said that was a great thing to do. Most of the time it's not really good for them. They get lost. If you just take Omnicom, for instance, they've got 240 agencies under their umbrella. So you're immediately faced with, okay, are we selling to an Omnicom agency? If that's the case, then it's going to be a very small deal with not much money changing hands because they don't have the authority to spend above a certain amount typically. And if not, if it's a bigger deal than that, then we're dealing with the huge Omnicom, and those deals are going to look so traditional that it's not going to be difficult to find a better opportunity for them purchased by either a non-traditional firm or a large independent firm. So I do less and less of those deals with the holding companies. Okay.
Worst new trends that you're seeing in acquisitions?
Well, one of them is this acqui-hire, which is sort of it's not like closing your firm and going to work for somebody else, and it's not like selling your firm for a lot of money. It's somewhere in the middle where you're tired of doing this on your own, or you want to play on a bigger stage, but your revenue doesn't justify some big purchase price. So you do, in essence, close your firm, but it doesn't look that way to the public. You are paid as a principal. You're paid as a higher level executive, and you get some sort of a signing bonus, and that's how you monetize the firm. But it's not a traditional sale at all. And I manage quite a few of those, and they can be a really good option. Usually, they're only done if the firm is usually smaller, so it doesn't justify a traditional purchase structure. So that's one. I list it as kind of a difficult transition or an example of something that's difficult because there isn't as much money traditionally. Another one is just that there's still some silly things happening here. So here I am, a principal of a firm, and somebody makes me an offer. And I'm talking with an advisor, whoever that is, and it looks like I'm going to get a little bit of money at closing, but the terms of the earnout are such that I'm still going to retain a whole bunch of entrepreneurial risk after the transaction. In other words, I'm still going to have to maintain a certain sales level of my clients, or I'm going to have to maintain a certain net profit level, or whatever that is, or I have to keep a client that represents a client concentration problem. So if I'm going to retain all that entrepreneurial risk, why don't I just keep the firm myself? Why would I sell it to somebody else and have a boss in the transaction? So those are the two. If you think of a teeter-totters, on one end, far end, the left is, okay, how much entrepreneurial risk am I offloading? And then that's the good part. The bad part is, how much of a boss do I still have? And so there are still many transactions where the person selling the firm, usually the person I'm working for, really wants to do this. But then when you start to do some sort of a crossover analysis for them and figure out what's the return look like if they sell, what's the return look like if they just keep the firm rather than selling, it doesn't make a lot of sense. So that's still something we haven't quite gotten over. About, I think 6 or 7 years ago, I did a study of how many firms actually sell, and it was 1/4 of 1%. That's so like 1 out of every 400 firms. Now, we can increase our odds significantly by just lopping off the outliers, the firms that don't run their businesses like a business, right? Or the ones that are just sort of playing between other jobs, or the firms that never grow. So if you're a serious firm and you know what you're doing, your odds are astronomically higher than that. Maybe they're 1 in 10 or 1 in 6 or something like that, but it's still pretty unlikely. So yeah, it's pretty sobering number.
It seems to me that you're talking about this spectrum of kind of entrepreneurial risk on one end and having a boss on the other end, and just thinking again about the earnout period. I've often thought of the earnout period as this sort of purgatory where you see these these principles. They're trapped in between. They sell and they think they're free, but they're not free, and they're locked down for a while. And I think it's probably the same thing in this idea of, okay, I've sold on paper, but I still have I'm still taking risk. In the earnout period, you're still taking risk, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Because if you don't meet those performance targets that both the buyer and seller have agreed to before the transaction was consummated, then you're not going to get a bunch of your money. How much of your money you don't get depends on the terms, but it could be anywhere from 60% of the total transaction value to maybe 20%, but that can have a huge, huge impact on what happens. And even if you intended to get all that money by staying around and really performing well, something might change. You might not like the culture. You might walk away. And of course, you have the option to do that in our modern world. Nobody can keep you, can make you stay there, but you're going to leave all that money on the table, and you're still going to be tied up in a non-compete. That's why it's so important to get purchased by the right firm if you are going to pursue this.
All right. Well, let's think of the children in all of this, or the employees.
Yeah.
When I try this on, and maybe we'll talk about this at some other time, but my exit strategy is death. My plan is to never sell and to never retire. But
and your employees might help you with that too. I could see that happening.
And every once in a while I try on, well, okay, what if there's a health issue and we had to sell, and I sell, and I say to the employees, hooray, we've sold the business. What would their reaction be? And I can think of the spectrum of reactions, but it's a real thing that you would have to consider if you're a human being.
Right.
How do employees tend to react?
Principals are terrified of this, and illogically so. For one thing, if you have a good culture, then once the employees do find out, and that's always tricky, like when do you tell them, because you don't want them to find out from somebody else, but you also don't want to distract them. But once they find out, if you have a good culture, the first thing that comes to mind for them is that they trust you. They're not going to believe that you would follow this transaction that isn't good for you. So they know that there are certain things that are important to you in the culture. So you're going to look for the same things in the acquiring firm. So to some degree, they do trust you. Once they learn more about it, they're usually excited, or they just they give it time, and usually they give it 6 to 9 months. So what excites them in particular, the most exciting thing to them is that wow, especially the ambitious employees, it's like, wow, now we have a ladder with more career rungs on it. So there's more opportunity for me. So now it's a 20-person firm now, but it's going to be a 200-person firm. That gives me room to grow and move up. That's the most exciting thing to them. The other is that usually the benefits package is better at the acquiring firm than the acquired firm. And that helps them. That isn't always true, but
makes sense though. Yeah.
Yeah. So those are the two. They almost always give it those 6 to 9 months, and then some of them might leave, but it's surprisingly not all that disruptive for them.
Let's kind of put a bow around this a little bit. Let's say I own an independent creative firm. I call you and I say, for whatever reasons, maybe it's the hard trigger of I'm looking at my lease, maybe my clients are driving me crazy. And I say, David, it's all up in the air. I want to do a valuation. You run a valuation, and then it's, okay, help me decide what to do. Is there kind of standard best practices? I know there's not a right thing to do for everybody in the same situation, but if you had to just take a guess based on your previous experience and say, well, I think the smartest thing to do is usually X, sell, keep running it, whatever the other options are. Do you have a thought on that?
From a money standpoint, a valuation isn't that expensive. So it's pretty easy to do that. And there are lots of reasons to do it, even if you aren't thinking of selling. Like, it might give you a sense of how a buyer might look at your firm. Then you know what to work on over the next 5 or 10 years. So it's a pretty low risk option. But regardless of that, because most people aren't going to do that, they're just thinking about it. Like, sort of like you phrased the question, I urge them to run their firm as if they're going to sell it, but don't necessarily aim towards selling it. So, and it's one of those rare times when they can, make their cake and eat it too, or buy their cake and eat it too, or however that thing goes, because running it as if they're going to sell it means they're going to be well positioned, because that's the most important thing in a sale. It also means that their role is going to be structured in a way that lends itself to a transaction, which is also really good for them. It makes it easier for them to get away on vacation or to take a sabbatical or whatever that is. Aiming for the right financial performance, that's going to help them now, whether they sell or not. So it's one of those cases where it really makes sense to run the firm as if you're going to sell it, and then enjoy life even if you don't, because the odds are you aren't going to sell it, but the odds are really good that if you run it as if you're going to sell it, you're going to love your firm, maybe even love it so much that you never have to sell it. One thing I wish principals would do is I wish they would consider the fact that maybe they just need to fix it. Maybe they don't need to sell it at all. Maybe the things that are driving them batty about this firm are fixable, and then they don't feel the pressure to sell it. Because I do think that who starts a firm with the idea of selling it? The odds are against it, right? And there's so many other reasons. Not many people are buying these kinds of firms anyway in this scope of things. So that's what I would say to them.
I think that's great advice. It really jives with my own beliefs on, we've kind of joked about this, and I've talked about my exit plan being death. And
right.
Because I've seen principals, they get to a certain age and they start to have one eye on the exit. They start thinking about selling, or maybe they've got a built-in buyer and a family member they're handing the firm off to, or a key employee. So whether there's a significant change of significant amount of money changing hands or not, they start to think about transitioning out of the business. There's not a lot that's sadder to watch than a business where the principal has quit taking risks and he or she is just kind of winding down, and the business is just becoming less and less relevant. So I say no exit, never sell. I recognize that a lot of times you're going to have to exit or sell or even retire. We're not all going to die with our boots on. The point I try to make when I talk about that is that, just don't always have one eye on the exit. Conversely, as you point out, I think if you run it, and I'll confess that I emailed you the other day, hey, what's my business worth? You didn't charge me $5,000 and you gave me a really high level.
I told you $20, yeah. But I wouldn't pay $20.
You said it's between this and that. And I thought, yeah, okay, that's about what I thought. So I think about that. I think about the value of the business, although I've committed to never selling it. I think there's a duality there that probably makes sense. And what ends up happening down the road is whatever's going to happen is what's going to happen. But I think that's smart advice. Run it like if you have to sell it, it's in good shape to sell, but don't have one eye on the exit all the time where you quit taking risk.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. good way to wrap it up.
This has been really great. I'm not sure if I'm closer to or further from selling my own business. I suspect you'll get some inquiries about the valuation. I know we need to end this, but there are different ways to value a creative firm. Do you want to talk at all about how you do yours, or is that part of your secret formula?
Well, the traditional way is to apply some multiple against a highly adjusted net. And so you have the phrase EBITDA, which stands for earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. I throw a lot of other things in there. So I use a particularly unique weighting system. I also normalize principal comp. And then I throw an entirely different method. I call it the inverse multiple method. That's a checksum on that. And then, of course, what multiple we choose changes quite a bit. And there are, unlike in the past, they were always 4 or 5. Nowadays, they range from 2.5 to 13.5. And so choosing the right multiple for you, the way a buyer is going to see it, is probably the most scientific part of it.
You just picked a number out of the air for me, though, when I texted you.
I think I said like a half or something. No.
All right, let's end here. This has been great. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Blair.
Thank you for listening to Two Bobs with David C. Baker and Blair Enns. Subscribe and learn more at twobobs.com. That's the number 2, BOBS.com.